Welcome to yet another reading diary. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is indeed the second diary for House of Leaves, and fortunately for me, the final one. I did in fact get through the rest of the book over the last couple of weeks like I hoped I would. It was looking a little bit sketchy there on the timing, but it did in fact get done, and I'm very glad for that. But now that I'm recording, I'm actually realizing I'm not wearing the right pair of glasses. In either case, today we're going to be talking about the remainder of the book that I did not talk about last week, which I guess I should probably double check and make sure that I know exactly which chapters those are, because I'm having a hard time remembering at the moment. Chapters 7 through 23, plus all the extraneous material. There's not a lot to talk about in terms of like appendix related stuff or whatever with this week's, or I guess this diary's reading. Most of it is just the content of the chapters themselves, and let me tell you, there was a lot, and it was crazy. There were a couple chapters that were a little bit crazier in there. If you know chapter 9 of this book, which could be called The Labyrinth for a good reason, is a lot and took a lot of time to get through all by itself. And then if you include everything else with it, there were some sections that were a little bit easier. If you've read the book, you know exactly why, because there's some sections where there's basically no words on some of the pages, and then there's other sections which are a little bit more in-depth. I don't know, House of Leaves just really surprised me here, going into spoiler-free kind of like impressions, how I thought about the book overall at this point. It was solid. I really enjoyed my time with this, and the end definitely wrapped it up in a more beautiful way than I expected. We'll say just general, like I said, spoiler-free stuff. Going through the exploration of the house is like the main thing that happened in this book, and you get a couple different bouts of that, and you get a couple different angles of exploration of some of that kind of tonally and thematically. A lot of that stuff was great. The kind of side story stuff with Johnny Truant is a little bit more hit or miss. It's a little bit harder to like really appreciate why it's there in the story. It did sort of come back around in the end, sort of, but not quite fully in my opinion, and is really the only thing holding this back from being like really, really great. I think at this point, House of Leaves kind of sits in that kind of range with like Infinite Jest and American Psycho as books that I really, really enjoyed, but which have some notable aspects that are like, yeah, this kind of holds it back a little bit, holds it back from being legitimately perfect. Books that I could consider being 4 out of 5 star masterpieces, you know, books that like are wholly kind of unique in what they're doing or how they're doing it, or books that are super enjoyable but have something holding them back. This is a little bit more related to Infinite Jest in this matter, where it's like it has some really great stuff, but some other stuff that's just barely holding it back. But that is, you know, wholly its own thing. House of Leaves is a very unique book, and if nothing else, deserves props for what it is doing, just for how unique it is. It is a really fun thing to explore because of how unique it is. But like I said, kind of the side stuff, the secondary storyline that's kind of going on, did sort of come around in the end, but wasn't really my favorite part of the book at all. But fortunately, the last couple of chapters, which are both just really super short, kind of thematically wrapped up the main body of what House of Leaves is in a really beautiful way that I appreciated a ton. So in the end, I came out really liking House of Leaves. I think my final rating for this is probably like 4.5 out of 5, and I'm still deciding whether I'm going to round that up or down. But because I kind of, you know, lumped it up with a couple of other 4 out of 5 star masterpieces, I think I'm probably going to round that down, but who knows, maybe I'll round it up because of just that sheer unique factor. I'm not entirely sure, but House of Leaves was definitely a trip. Okay, so let's jump into more spoiler talk now, because there's not a whole lot else I can say about House of Leaves without just getting into direct spoilers, and kind of like what I was doing last week, I didn't wind up taking very many notes about what's actually going on here, so we're just going to go ahead and cover the book kind of chapter by chapter, approximately according to its content, and basically my going over some of my impressions of some of that stuff that happened without actually you know, trying to summarize it per se. So I'm going to be like skipping over a lot of stuff. I skipped over some stuff the last one of these diaries that I did as well. It's not intended to be a summary of what happened, just kind of some of the bigger, broader strokes and my impressions of kind of that material. So I discovered while I was reading over this last couple weeks, one of the first items in the first appendix is called Outlines and Chapter Titles, and you get kind of the rundown into the different pieces that make up the Davidson record and all those pieces in order, how it's going over them throughout the book, which is super interesting. But then the next one is possible chapter titles, so you can see all 23 chapters with potential titles for them. So, you know, last week we went over the film and other general stuff in those first 6 chapters or something like that. But this week we're going to be going over the rest of the stuff, and I'm going to be running off of these chapter titles a little bit to kind of help to remind me what actually happened in each one. It's really crazy just how much material I ended up getting through, because most of what I covered last time was just kind of like building up the stuff that's going on, building up kind of the reputation of the Davidson house, and also getting to the point of Davidson's first personal exploration of the house before deciding to hire other people to explore it more fully. And then also getting a little bit of background on Johnny Truant as well from one of the other appendix sections. And that's like the bulk of what's happening in 2 weeks ago, what I covered 2 weeks ago. But this week, we're actually getting like the full exploration and everything that happens afterwards, the entire rest of the book. So we have a lot to get through. Chapter 7 is titled in the appendix Holloway. And that is because you're introducing a character called Holloway Roberts, who arrives to kind of take the head of exploring the actual mysterious hallway in Davidson's house. And he has a couple people with him named, I believe they're, what are they, Wax and Jed, I think their names are. I might be mistaken those off the top of my head. I know I'm seeing Wax on the page here. Yeah, Jed. Yep, those are the 2 names. Good thing I can remember names after I just finished reading this book. What is it, yesterday? Yeah, look at me go. So good. Anyway, Holloway, Wax, and Jed are introduced in this chapter. You get a little bit of background as to kind of who these 3 people are to a degree. That's part of what the chapter's doing. But then you also have a couple of the early explorations. If you don't know, with the Davidson record, you have certain sections, you know, kind of in that chapter outline, like I mentioned before, you have sections that are called Exploration A, which is Davidson's first visit when he first goes in. And then you have explorations number 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are all the, you know, Holloway-related explorations, plus some other stuff that we'll get to a little bit later. And chapter 7 here goes through the first 3 of those explorations, which are largely just based on Holloway and the other 2 kind of going and finding like the big chamber that Davidson nearly got lost in when he went in for the first time, and then exploring a little bit further each time until eventually they come across this spiral staircase that just goes down and down and down seemingly forever. And that kind of becomes like the checkpoint for where a lot of the rest of the exploration of the house comes from. And these first 3 explorations, like I said, there's not a whole ton that's really going on with them. The first couple of them don't last very long. For example, exploration number 3 takes like 20 hours, which I believe is those 3 people taking a long time to go down the spiral staircase and then coming back just to see if there is a bottom to the staircase, which is, you know, kind of a frankly kind of terrifying idea, quite frankly, to think that there'd be like a basically endless, or might as well be endless if you're having to spend 7 hours just to go down or up them. Very crazy section. You get these early explorations and also get a little bit of the internal family dynamic happening with Davidson, who stayed behind in the house alongside Tom and Karen. Sorry, I've developed a cough the last couple days, so I'm probably going to have to clear my throat a little bit in this video. I apologize. But you get some of that stuff at home as well, kind of some of the tensions regarding the house, where, Karen's a little bit more satisfied, not as distraught with what's going on because Davidson himself directly isn't going in, but there's still definitely some tension with these characters and with the exploring all of the stuff that's going on. There's also more sections of Johnny Truant just kind of being Johnny Truant in the footnotes here, but at this point there's too many of these footnotes and I don't remember what a lot of them had to do. But we'll probably talk about Johnny Truant a little bit more near the end of this video, specifically because these kinds of I guess these sidetracking with his footnotes here, basically they continue to have very little to do with the actual Davidson record. So I don't feel any drive to actually talk about them here while talking about the actual sections. But yeah, that's basically chapter 7, is going through those first 3 explorations and what those entail, setting up a little bit for exploration number 4, because exploration number 4 is like the big one. That's the one where these characters expect to be inside the labyrinth for like, I think upwards of a couple weeks or something like that. They expect to be in here for a long time. And that's kind of what chapter 8 talks about a little bit more, is having another character come in and be involved with manning kind of like a radio station where they've set up like a base camp basically in the Davidson's living room while the other 3 actually go inside. There's going to be somebody who's been manning this entire time, basically. But for exploration number 4, you have a few weeks where you expect for Holloway and Jed and Wax to just be in there for a while, exploring, picking up more samples from the walls. That's something that they've been doing this whole time. But Chapter 8 explains to us how they lose radio contact, which was kind of expected. But you get a crazy sequence where everybody in the house starts to hear tapping, like as if somebody's tapping on all the walls around them, and this tapping inexplicably ends up being the SOS signal for some reason. So it's like the house is talking to them, but the characters start to suspect that it's like Holloway and them inside the house kind of SOSing to them. And Chapter 8 is going through the tension relating to that and the fact that nobody's come back, and after a while it's like, okay, they've been in there too long, somebody should probably like go in and just see if we can find them. And then you start to have Davidson and Billy Reston basically, and Tom as well, go and make plans to actually enter the house, enter the hallway again to chase after the other 3 who seem to probably be lost. That's what Chapter 8 is determining, realizing that, hey, Exploration 4 is done, it's over, like they probably need help, so let's go in and help them, and that's what they plan to do. Chapter 9 is the labyrinth and is absolutely the craziest part of the story, like for sure. Like it's actually really, really crazy. The labyrinth, I'm pretty sure, is the one where you actually get to see Exploration 4 a little bit on the inside, where you're actually getting Holloway's POV and Jed's POV and Wax's POV, and it's called the Labyrinth for good reason, because like I said, it took a long time to get through this, because you have a lot of sections which are just kind of like referring back to one another, flipping back and forth between pages a ton. This is something that happens a lot in here. You also get introductions of a lot of like random stuff, like this little window in here, and how this window is its own like little footnote sort of, that continues on for several pages, and it just continues within this window. So if you're reading that material, you're reading within that window, but flipping to this random page here, you get crap like this. Like, what does this even mean? Where at one point you have like a footnote that is referenced, and it will take you to like this section over here. Sorry, there's just too much to grab onto with this book, and it's a big book anyway. You read like this left section over here, which once you've read that left section, it makes you read that left section on every page as you continue on. By the time you've gotten through that, it references you to the right section over here, which is upside down, so you have to read it this way and go back. But it turns out that all of that information is basically meaningless anyway, and there's like a whole bunch of other stuff going on with the actual reading process of Chapter 9 that just makes it an adventure. chapter is really impossible to describe just how crazy it is to try to read this chapter without just reading it. There were actually a couple sections as well that did require me to like take a picture of it and mirror the picture so that I could actually read those sections, which was also unexpected and crazy, because I was under the impression that I wouldn't have to do that, but there were a couple of paragraphs where I did actually have to do that. But chapter 9 is insane. A lot of what it's doing is disorienting you, kind of the way that the labyrinth that is the inside of the house is disorienting you. So thematically, chapter 9 really, really, really works and sells itself because of this. It's just such... It was honestly a really fun experience, you know, as long as it took me 2 days. I had to spend 2 mornings reading chapter 9 alone. It was an experience, and it was a lot, and like I said, there's plenty of the material that is actually pretty worthless. There's a lot of what's happening in chapter 9 you can skim over. Basically, all of those multi-page footnotes, like I referenced, like the one that's inside the window and the one that's on the left side, the one that's on the right side, a lot of that stuff you don't have to read because you're getting this experience where you're exploring the inside of the house with Holloway and Jed and Wax, and at one point you have like references to like what the house is similar to, but you get like very specific descriptions of what the house is like in terms of like temperature and stuff like that, and appearance, like all the walls having like a sort of ashy gray color and texture to them. That kind of stuff. That's what the wall samples are, is that kind of ash stuff. But in either case, the funny part of chapter 9 is like when it references moments of, but the house is easier to explain more by what it is not, except it's not, because what it does is then it goes into the footnote with like the window, for example, and it'll be like, this house is not able to be described with, it is not constructed with all of this list of materials that just lasts pages upon pages of this inside the window footnote. And alongside that window footnote there, you also have a similar case where it then goes into, okay, but now it's like not similar to this list of like architects and stuff like that. And you have a whole list of names that's just architects, people who have done certain types of building work and describing what type of building inside the house is not, which is like every name under the sun. And then you have another section similarly related, although I think technically the one that happened before the list of architects was a list of buildings that this house is not similar to. And you have the same thing where it's just 1.5 million buildings that are like, why are you even listing these out? So you get like building materials and stuff that this house is clearly not made out of. You have that, and then you have, like I said, the specific building examples that it is not similar to, architects whose work this does not borrow from, other similar types of stuff going on. So a lot of chapter 9 is just like a complete misdirection of making you read these endnotes that are just telling you what the house is not like, which very clearly you don't really need to read, but it was just super funny just like skimming over. I was like, I was actually seriously reading it for a little bit, especially with like the material section, thinking that eventually it would come to an end, and it just doesn't. And then I realized like, okay, wait a minute, skip to the end of that, or rather skim to the end of it, look at the next footnote and realize, oh, it's just doing the same thing, except it's buildings now. And then, oh, it's just doing the same thing, except it's architects now. And it just keeps on doing this kind of thing. There are some of the footnotes that are still somewhat relevant, that are still like making you flip back and forth and all of this kind of stuff. You know, like it happens, but a lot of the endnote or side note material, footnote material, whatever you want to call it, because they happen all over the place on the page in the construction of the book, a lot of it doesn't matter. You don't actually have to read it. It's just like, okay, it's not like anything any person has ever done or seen before. Cool. Okay, got it. You can skim through all of that. But even so, chapter 9 is still kind of a labyrinth to read, because you're still getting some of that experience that those characters are. like I said, Holloway and Jed and Wax, what they're experiencing, what they're seeing, is a couple of descriptions of what the house is like in here. Let me see if I can find a particular example. It's like temperature 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty much exactly freezing, plus or minus 8 degrees. Completely absent of light, completely silent except for like certain growls and stuff like that that can be heard in the house, which there are a couple different theories for what the growls are. The one that I'm personally privy to based off of kind of what I read in House of Leaves is that those growls are probably just the house shifting and changing while people are in there, and that's what that sound is that they're hearing. And then there's no true north within the house because magnetism doesn't work, like compasses just don't work in there. There's no air movement or anything like that in there either, so there's these various descriptions of what the house is like in there, and that's kind of what you're experiencing. But in terms of like the story, in terms of what Holloway and Jed and Wax experience, they kind of start to go a little bit crazy in there. Not super crazy. Holloway starts to lose his marbles in that he gets really paranoid at a certain point, starts becoming convinced that there's a monster around, and he wants to hunt the beast. He wants to hunt the monster because he has his rifle in here while they're exploring. But Jed and Wax are a little bit more like, no, I think we should just leave now, because after a couple weeks they're like, we should go, like we're running out of provisions, we only have so much time to get back, so we should go back. And Holloway doesn't want to go back. He's convinced that he needs to hunt this monster, and so Jed and Wax just kind of like let him do that. They leave. They're just like, okay, we're just gonna leave. They start backtracking, and they realize that like the inside of the house just like swallows anything that's left inside of it. Because in order to not get lost in this labyrinth, they have like a fishing line that they're using to be able to guide them back, and like different flags and other like stuff that they can mark as like checkpoints along the way. And what they realize after they've been in the house for a couple weeks is that these checkpoints are like disintegrating. They're like destroyed, maybe as if a beast got to them or something like that. That's part of what sets Holloway off a little bit. But it turns out it's probably just that nothing can be permanent inside the house, so the house just kind of swallows it eventually, or this section of the house just kind of swallows those flags, swallows those checkpoints, kind of destroys it. It like disintegrates it. It stops existing at a certain point. So they're like, okay, good thing we're still able to see some of the residue of some of these checkpoints here, because clearly none of this stuff is permanent, and we just need to get back as soon as possible. But then part way back, Jed and Wax get attacked by Holloway, even though he kind of wandered off. Somehow the house led them back to each other somehow. And Holloway, while trying to hunt the beast, winds up shooting, I believe it's Wax in the shoulder. I forget which one is which. I apologize for that. But he shoots one of the other two, one of his two companions, like in the shoulder, causes like major blood loss. And the other one, I'm pretty sure it's Jed, has to like drag the other one like all the way back. And eventually just has to hide from Holloway, who's continuing to hunt them at this point for some reason. Like, he's just gotten super paranoid. Until they end up in a room where Jed's like lost all hope. It's just like, we're gonna die in here. Like, we can't get back. I can't get him back. Like, this is gonna be impossible. And he starts like having his own like little personal breakdown or something like that at this point. And this personal breakdown of his is basically him. It involves him happening to tap on the ground, which notably, he's not tapping on the ground in the SOS, but people suspect that something about him tapping on the ground or whatever in his grief or in his desperation, that the house kind of converts that to an SOS for Navidson and Tom and Billy Reston, who are in the house. You know, they hear this tapping as an SOS signal, so they interpret it as that, like they need to go in and save whoever needs saving. Which I'm presuming is probably like the house itself, like kind of shifting the perception of this tapping to invite more people in it. I don't know why that would be the case, but like, I don't know why not. Why it would not be the case, you know? So it's one of those things that's kind of a little bit open to interpretation, but you get to experience all of this in Chapter 9, and that's the bulk of like what Chapter 9 actually does from a story front. I have no idea what all of Johnny Truant's footnotes have to do in here anymore. Like, it's just kind of whatever. Like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about him at the end. But yeah, you have some of that, and then a little bit more of like the sort of commentary aspects of what's going on as well, kind of relating what's happening in chapter 9 in the labyrinth to some other stuff, which, I don't feel like I really need to like get into. Quite frankly, it's not super important for what I'm doing with these diaries here. But another final note I guess I'll add for chapter 9 is that it also has you flipping back and forth to the appendix a couple times to read some sections of stuff that are like barely relevant, if at all, and also a little confusing. Things like the Pelican poems, I'm still not sure what's going on with those, but they're there. But yeah, that's chapter 9 essentially. Chapter 9 was big. It was like, let me see if I can do the math here. It's like 45 pages within the book. And that's 45 pages of, like I said, just going back and forth, flipping back and forth between stuff. You have various different appendix and section stuff that are several pages that you have to read in there. If you're actually reading all of the side note material, including the stuff that does not matter, this chapter alone could take you multiple hours to read. It took me multiple hours to read, and that was even after I discovered that I could skim half of it. So that was an adventure. But next up comes chapters, let's see, it'll be chapters like 10 through 12 essentially is where I'll do this, because chapters 10 through 12 are the rescue, essentially, kind of the section where, well, maybe 13 in there as well. I'm not entirely sure what 13 was doing off the top of my head anymore, like specifically, and we'll explain that a little bit more, but for the purposes of this video, we'll just count chapters 10 through 12 here. Like I said, this is the section where following chapter 9 is a godsend, because now you're suddenly going through like a ton of pages. You're going through like 150, 160 pages, where a ton of it is like this kind of stuff. And that is because in chapters 10 through 12, the rescues part 1 and 2, you have Navidson and Tom and Billy Reston entering the house and their experience in there, and like kind of tonally and thematically, it kind of makes sense for the sections to be in here a little bit. You're getting to see the house a little bit more up front in a different manner. I don't know really how to explain it, but like the way that it is structured here does make sense. Let me see if I can find some examples of it. Like there's the top of these couple of pages, 172 and 173, where it says, can Navidson's house exist without the experience of itself? Is it possible to think of that place as unshaped by human perception? So you have like kind of the tone of what those are saying just at the top of these pages, and otherwise blank, because it's kind of trying to subvert that what we would naturally expect to see in a book. There's also a couple other sections that work pretty well to describe this, but some of those happen a little bit later as well. I'm just trying to see if I can find anything to describe this better to you. Yeah, it's just kind of hard to find anything specific, but like you just have things like this, where the dark line where the eye persists in seeing, blank, 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 whatever, seeing something that was never there to begin with, like just kind of, if there's some way to describe the actual content itself, I would say it's pretty surreal, and so it's being written on the page in a pretty surreal way, which I guess is kind of what I mean by tonally it's relevant and makes sense. So chapter 10, very short and quick, but it is that group where Billy Reston and Tom and Davidson, they all make it to that staircase, and Billy Reston and Davidson decide to go down the staircase, even though Reston uses a wheelchair, but Tom stays at the top of the staircase to kind of be like a sort of radio conduit, so that the radio base camp within like the living room of the house can communicate to the stairs, because that's basically where they can communicate to, and then from the stairs they can communicate a little bit further into the house probably. And that's kind of what they're trying to do here. But Billy Reston and Davidson go down the spiral staircase. I believe it happens in chapter 10. I mean, obviously it happens in chapter 10. Who am I kidding? But you experience that, and it turns out the spiral staircase no longer takes 7+ hours to descend. All of a sudden only takes like a couple of minutes, basically. So this is evidence that the house changes, pretty directly, and leads to the theory, a sort of quasi-theory, that maybe the house changes depending on who's perceiving it. So Navidson at this point knows that this spiral staircase has a bottom, so like maybe the house is shaping itself to his perception of, okay, the staircase has a bottom, and it's realistically can't be that far down, so it's not that far down anymore, because he knows he's going to reach the bottom, so he reaches the bottom a little bit quicker than the others do, like the first time they explore it, for example. So that's something that you get to experience a little bit within the chapters, some of that interesting stuff. You also experience Billy Reston and Navidson encountering Holloway in this chapter as well. Where they end up down the staircase, and they come up across Holloway, and Holloway's still like hunting. And then there's like this one section of the house where there's a huge section of like doors, for whatever reason. So like there's this section of the book. Let me see if I can find the section. Right, yeah. Then just as the strobe captures him lifting the weapon, Holloway lifting the weapon, presumably now aiming at the blinding flash, we hear a series of sharp cracks. Neither Navidson nor Reston have any idea where these sounds are coming from, though gratefully the stills reveal what is happening. All these doors. And then this is where, you have this section. All these doors behind the man are slamming shut. One after another after another. So like, it's using the sort of one page after another to describe that door slamming shut one after another. Like I said, surrealism being used within the construction of the book itself. So you have that happening. You experience Billy Reston there, and then I believe you also get sections where like the text is arranged really strange on the page, and sometimes that makes for having to construct sentences together in a strange way. In a particular chapter later in the book we'll get to, that's something that happens. But like I said, you have this confrontation with Holloway where the house's doors just kind of all slam shut. Holloway's kind of like stuck down here now, and Navidson and Reston happen to find Jed and Wax in a room, and they're like, okay, we're going to carry these guys out, because one of them is basically bleeding to death, and the other one, I can't remember what happened to the other one. I think he might have just like succumbed maybe to the elements, basically like being cold, like hypothermia, I think might be part of it. But basically, Billy and Navidson have to like drag the other two out, essentially, is what's happening. And that's what chapter 10 does. Chapter 11 goes a little bit of a different direction. It explores Tom's story within the house specifically, including like little diary moments where he's talking into a camera, where he's just stuck at the top of the stairs, just kind of waiting for the other two, having his own little breakdown. Get a little bit of a glimpse into his psyche, but that's basically all chapter 11 does. Kind of a bridge until Navidson and Reston make it back to the foot of the stairway, where they call up to Tom, and Tom, actually they're able to call to Tom with the radios earlier, and just like, hey, I'm going to need you to meet us down at the bottom of the staircase so that we can get Jed and Wax up the stairs and to safety. And Tom like takes a couple of steps down the stairs and has a panic attack. He's like, I can't do this. So he actually leaves, and we see in chapter 11 he leaves, and he actually comes back after having gone to the store to get like pulleys and ropes and other types of stuff. So he's able to set up a pulley system at the spiral staircase to actually like let a little gurney down into the staircase, that distance down below, where chapter 12, you have Navidson and Reston making it back to the bottom of the staircase down there. They're just like, well, Tom didn't meet us down here. What a prick, But instead, it's not because he wasn't down there. He had the better idea of doing a pulley system so that they could just pull these unconscious bodies down and also get Billy Reston out of there, since, he's in the staircase, in a wheelchair. Words getting confused in my brain, but as these people are being carried up, the first two bodies are able to be carried up. One of them's basically dead at this point, and the other one's just got major hypothermia, if I'm not mistaken. Do both of them live? I think both of them live, actually. Do they? I don't remember. I'm very sorry. sometimes little details like this can kind of slip my brain when it doesn't really matter that much, and in this case it doesn't really matter that much. In either case, the bodies are up. Billy Reston is being carried away, but then the spiral staircase changes partway through this sequence where Billy Reston is able to be saved by Tom up at the top, but the staircase ends up becoming like impossibly deep, where Navidson does enough math within chapter 12 to basically confirm that like the staircase is now deeper than the entire circumference of the Earth, not even the radius or diameter of the Earth, but the entire circumference of the Earth is less miles than the amount of time that it took for a quarter to drop from the top of the staircase to where Navidson now is. And he's like, okay, well, that's not great, but Tom makes it back into the living room and saves the other three, basically, and they're all like unsure what to do about Navidson. He's just stuck in here now. That's where chapter 12 ends. So chapter 13, I guess I'm remembering now, is a little bit more of the direct kind of confrontation with like, okay, what happened inside the house? What happened with Navidson anyway, and that's kind of what you're seeing a little bit more. If I'm not mistaken, that's a lot of what's going on in here, is that final escape from Navidson, or maybe chapter 12 is finishing that. I forget off the top of my head. But 13, let's see. Oh yeah, 13's even bigger than that, actually. 13 is called the Minotaur. We'll talk about this just a little bit. 13 is kind of like chapter 9 a little bit, where there's some other stuff going on with footnotes that are a little bit confusing and interesting to note, because like you get a lot of relations from this house being compared to the Labyrinth of Crete, which of course has relations to the Minotaur, and so like there's a whole commentary angle about this that is like part of the book, but for whatever reason any reference to like the Minotaur and stuff like that is struck out in red text with strike through going on in it, where Zampano, whatever his name is, compiling all of this text, for whatever reason, really just wanted to remove any reference to Minotaurs and stuff like that, or anything thereby associated with regards to the house for some reason. It's kind of mysterious why, but that is something that we get. Chapter 13 gives us a little bit of what happens to some of these people directly. You have the Wait, a little section in here, like I said, where they're just kind of trying to figure out what they're going to do about Navidson, if anything. Like, okay, well, he might have a few days of provisions and that's about it. So what are we going to do about that? You then get a little bit of a cutaway into Holloway, where you get apparently Holloway's tapes have been recovered at some point in time, and you get to see what happened to him inside the house, and apparently he did done shot himself after basically going crazy, before you see his body just disappear, being eaten up by the house. So he's gone forever. And then the escape, where you get to experience Navidson actually escaping the house, where he basically just decided at some point, it's just like, well, I have to reach the top of the stairs eventually, and I don't have any other options, so I'm just going to climb the stairs. And he does, and somehow makes it out. So, like, the stairs decided to shrink up and allow him to get out at some point, and that's something that happens. That's chapter 13, but chapter 13 actually ends with a very climactic sequence. It's a very early section for a climactic sequence, because once you have this little escape that happens, it's like, okay, we're out. We can leave now. We don't have to be in the house anymore. Karen has decided that like she's going to take the kids back to New York. She's done with this crap, which understandable enough. But then the house starts going crazy and like starts collapsing. And it's like swallows Tom. You know, like that's the climactic moment of chapter 13, where it swallows Tom. Karen is saved by Navidson. Tom saves Daisy. Chad was already outside of the house. Chad and Daisy are Navidson's two kids, by the way, in case you forgot. Billy Reston made it out as well. But Tom is swallowed up by the house. So Tom dies in chapter 13. And like they make it out of the house. But again, Holloway got stuck in there. He's dead. And then Tom died, which sucks a lot, actually. But that's a really crazy place for a climactic sequence. I was not expecting this at all. Definitely wasn't. surprised me a lot, but kind of set up some really interesting stuff, because now you're not just getting a resolution or anything like that, you're getting like a whole second wind to the story after chapter 13, because chapter 14, let me see if I can find that chapter title again, chapter 14, 15, and like 16 kind of explain to us a little bit of what's going on with the house a little bit. You have some background with like what happens to Karen afterwards, where she goes and what she does. We get revealed that like the 5.5 minute hallway and whatever the short clip of exploration number 4 that was the VHS short of exploration number 4 that was discussed like very early in the book is like these 2 short films about the house that were distributed early. These were actually created by Karen, because at some point like Davidson stayed. He didn't stay at the house specifically, but he decided to stay around the house to see if there was anything else he could uncover, and also to be able to work on his tapes, all of the film and stuff that he collected there. But eventually he actually gives all the film to Karen, but he's still down in Virginia while she's up in like New York or something. And Karen is the one that actually constructs these little short films. She's the one doing this material, which is an interesting revelation. I don't know how important it is, but you get to see a little bit of the background of some of that, some of her reaction, and some of a couple of other little films she made, like talking to other people and other commentators about these little short films about the house in that sense as well, which were good. You also get a little bit more background about Davidson. Like there's this mystery built up early in the book about this like one woman character, or a female name that he would bring up sometimes, named Delisle. But Karen didn't know who Delisle was, and nobody else knew who Delisle was. But finally, we get like a reference, like we know who Delisle is now, and it's the name of a little starving girl who died just a few minutes after a picture that Davidson took of her while doing photojournalist stuff, and he named her Delisle, and this like kind of kept her in his head because this picture is what made him famous in the world of this book. And you know, there's plenty of guilt to go around with like photojournalists and you know, taking pictures of something but not doing anything about what might be the subject of the pictures. There's a lot of like different questions to ask about that, and Davidson obviously has thought about this a lot. So we get a reference just like, okay, so we know who this mysterious character is. We also understand that like Karen actually does kind of care a good bit in here what's going on with him as well. You see this in chapters 14 and 15. Like I said, Karen made these films, which is really interesting. But then chapter 16 is called Science, and chapter 16 gives us a really crazy, mysterious opening into the story of this book that like doesn't really get any direct answers, which I like. It's just one of those things to ponder about as the reader. You remember how I said the explorations inside the house would take like samples of the walls and stuff? Well, Davidson has these samples tested, and it turns out that like with each layer deeper into the house that the explorations went, the samples get older and older, so as to eventually date as older than literally the Earth itself would be. So that's interesting. There's an entire section of this chapter as well that's like just blotted out material that is like all redacted, but you get to see the footnotes of all that stuff, and that's how you get some implicit information that there's material here that's like, oh yeah, this is all really old stuff. The house is very, very, very old, which is strange. And this kind of sets Davidson off. He's like, okay, well, I need to explore this house a little bit more for some reason. There are interviews with Billy Reston, for example, that talk about how he was like finally told by Davidson that like he's kind of over it and that basically are ready to go. But it turns out that Davidson was hiding things, and Davidson decides to go back into the house in chapter 17. And more specifically 19, maybe 20, I forget off the top of my head, discuss this a little bit more in depth. But you have Davidson actually going back to the house. He was apparently gathering materials so that he could take a several week long voyage into the house. Actually, yeah, that's something that I made a mistake about earlier. Exploration number 4 wasn't meant to last a couple of weeks. It was meant to last like several days. It was only meant to be like 4 or 5 days, maybe 6. I don't remember, but it was meant to be less than a week, and it was after it had been a little bit like a couple days longer than they were supposed to be gone, and after they started hearing the SOS taps and stuff like that. That was when the SOS, when the rescue was enacted. It's Billy Reston making provisions for himself to go back into the hallway of the house for a couple of weeks, and he does this behind Billy Reston's back. And then eventually goes back inside the house. And that's what Chapter 17 talks about a little bit, but a little bit more from a commentary type of angle, because Chapter 17 discusses a couple of theories regarding why Navidson went back into the house. Some people talk about it being like one of the theories, one of the claims is that it's because he wanted, or he felt a distinct, like, keen ownership over the house to some degree or something, if you want to call it that. If that's how you want to explain it, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But he felt a distinct, like, ownership over the house, and so he went back in because he didn't want anybody else to be able to explore it or something. There's a different claim that is like, no, it's a little bit more of a different thing. There are a couple other explorations or explanations. The third explanation, there's like 3, and the Haven-Slocum theory is basically not included. Like, it's redacted. It's like 2 pages missing, is literally described here at some point. But so anyway, you get some commentary theories about why Navidson went into the house, and that's basically what Chapter 17 is about. And then Chapter 18 is a little bit more about the history of the house itself, where you have Karen's POV going to talk to, like, the real estate agent who sold them the house, and going a little bit into the fact that the house has had a lot of owners, and people describe it as unstable, that kind of thing. And Chapter 19... Chapters 18 and 19 are very short, and then Chapter 19, I forget what that's about exactly, but it's where you get a little bit more of an explicit explanation regarding the Delisle stuff that's going on. But yeah, so I guess there's that. But yeah, that's Chapters 18 and 19. They're very short. They're just kind of external stuff, still exploring a little bit more of the implications of why Navidson went back into the house. But chapters 20 through the end, 20, 21, 22, and 23 are, well, actually not counting chapter 21, actually. It's chapters 20, 22, and 23, because we'll talk about 21 a little bit later when we talk about the Johnny Truant stuff. But chapter 20 is another one of these chapters, kind of like chapters 11 and 13 were, I think, off the top of my head. It doesn't really matter. It's one where you get more pages like this, and things get even more crazy, get even more weird with the construction of this, because you have even sections where, like, the text is diagonal on the page, making little triangles. That's fun. But chapter 20 is Navidson re-exploring the house, going into the house and exploring it for a couple of weeks with a bunch of other equipment, and essentially getting lost in there. You have more properties about the house being weird, such as Navidson being able to bike along in certain sections of the house and not having to pedal, like going fast enough with an odometer that he's able to travel, like, hundreds of miles in a day on the bike in here. But, like, if he pedals one direction in the hall, he's like, it's going downhill, and he'll be like, this doesn't seem safe, so he'll, like, go the other direction to make up some ground so that he's not just lost in here forever. And the same thing happens. So it's like a perception thing, the house being weird with perception. But Navidson gets lost in the house. He spends a couple weeks in here, and eventually, like, gets stuck in blackness. That's where the chapter ends, basically, is Navidson getting stuck in the house and, like, basically coming up on the brink of death in there, like hypothermia, like he's lost everything. He doesn't have any more supplies of anything at all. There's something to do with a title called House of Leaves that is within the world here that he reads while he's in the labyrinth, and he has to use the pages and, like, light the pages to burn them to continue to read for some reason. I don't know what's going on with all of that, but that's something that happens in there. But chapters 22, 23, at the end of the book are very short, where something that happened earlier with, I believe it was, what, those Karen chapters that I explained before. Let me double check real quick. Go back to my appendixes. Where those chapters, like chapters 15 and 16 or somewhere in there? No, it's probably more like, oh, sorry, my phone alarm is going off. Chapter 18, I believe it is, the history of Ash Tree Lane. You have Karen returning to the Davidson house as well. Something that she does is she returns to the Davidson house, but when she returns to the house, the hallway, the mysterious hallway, the closet hallway isn't there. The other abnormalities about the house that they all discovered, that was the reason why Tom came and the reason why Holloway came and the reason why everybody else came, those abnormalities are like gone in the house, and Karen's just like kind of stuck in the house, and she's waiting for Davidson to reappear again. There are parent tapes and stuff like that that suggest that like she hears Davidson murmuring or speaking sometimes, like as if he's inside the house, which is something that we know the house has done before. And we also get to see the explanation of a shot where Karen is in the children's room looking at stuff, like exploring one of her tapes, which is a little bit mysterious, and then the wall behind her just like opening up into blackness. And that's before chapter 20, actually, where you then have Davidson's last exploration number 5 of the house. But chapter 22 returns us to that shot of Karen with the wall behind her opening up, and her realizing that that's that, and her just going into the empty hole in the wall, and it closing up behind her, and an explanation of her finding Davidson in the pitch blackness, in the void, where he's basically freezing to death, her holding him, and then them somehow ending up on the outside of the house, like on the lawn in front of the house, basically, and all of them surviving. And then a little brief explanation of what's going on with Davidson constructing the rest of the film after the fact, like the full film after the fact. Just really interesting stuff, where I thought that this ending for the Davidson record itself was actually really beautiful. This was what like really wrapped the book up in a way that I enjoyed. Was like, yes, Davidson going back to the house against probably any form of good advice or anything like that, like maybe don't go back inside there, and he does anyway, and then Karen deciding to go back because she really does care about him, and going back to the house and being there, and then when the wall opens up for her going in and finding Davidson again, and the two of them surviving. Something about this just kind of thematically really worked for me as like a deterioration of like bounds in a relationship, and like obstructions getting in the way of familial operations, as being like the house being a sort of like metaphor for this, but then the whole thing coming back around to the family's okay, like including, there's a section in the reading from the last couple weeks, I don't remember what chapter specifically it's from, but there's a section where you go over like some of the symptoms of things, of people that what people have been experiencing who are part, you know, related to the house to some degree, which most had to do with Davidson and Karen, of course, but even the kids, where like there's some severity of what these symptoms are like, but then after a little while after the house, like after being away from the house for a while, where they're returned more or less to normal, for some of them, which is, I don't know, it's just really interesting. So the thematic stuff that a person could potentially go into with House of Leaves with regarding family drama and obstructions in a relationship, and the way that that can affect not just your family, but also other people, like friends, and like Tom getting lost and Holloway getting lost inside the house. And, you know, I don't read House of Leaves 100% as what it is. I also read it as like a thematic piece about like just general human relationships, and thematically these last 2 chapters kind of confirmed that for me. It's just like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can go into here that's really interesting, and it just worked for me. It's hard to explain a little bit more in depth of why. I would have to think about it a little bit more. I'd have to write a review about it, but I don't even know if I could really properly go into it. House of Leaves is one of those books that, with regards to some of that thematic material specifically, I think would be infinitely better if I reread the book, but I don't want to reread the book right now, that's for sure. I don't have time for that. But it's one of those things where it's like I would have to reread this book. This book is rich enough with enough stuff that like somebody could go through this body of work and really, really get into it, super in depth, and like piece together a bunch of their own stuff, their own theories, their own thoughts, their own timeline related stuff with regard to both storylines, actually, which I guess will take us into the next section here in just a second. There's a lot of stuff that like a reader could do with House of Leaves and make it into a really, really in-depth like analysis. At first I thought like, the in-world analyses of the Davidson record being like hundreds, even thousands of pages long was something that I found kind of amusing in some of the footnotes that were mentioned. But I could legitimately see somebody making an entire book, writing an entire book, really analyzing and piecing together our real life version of House of Leaves and going into a ton of different stuff about it. That's something that would be really fun, but not something that I'm ever going to do. But something that I could definitely see being possible. It's really, really interesting to read into all of that, but I've been skirting around the Johnny Truant stuff this whole time, so we'll kind of mention some of this a little bit. I really don't know what to think about the Johnny Truant material in the book, because a lot of the footnotes of his ramblings and stuff over the last couple weeks were just kind of continuing along with, just following along with his degradation of sanity, I guess you could say, while constructing the Davidson record. That's basically the bulk of what you get. Most of the actual events that actually occur within Johnny Truant's storyline here don't really matter, and they're not super relevant. They're just kind of giving you a way to inspect his psyche. You get ways to inspect whether or not he's an honest narrator, or whether or not his compilation of the Davidson record is trustworthy. You have some questions regarding some of that. You also have some questions regarding some of his own story as well, in related fashion. And that, I don't know, like the Johnny Truant stuff, I'm just kind of hit or miss on. I don't hate it all, of course. I definitely don't hate most of it. But it's a lot. A lot of what you could do in terms of like an analysis of House of Leaves, like I was saying before, a lot of it would just be looking into the timeline of Johnny Truant, his personal history with regard to what he says about it, and with regard to what his mother's letters say about it from one of the appendices that we talked about in the last diary, and also his timeline of various different journal entries that he made here. Chapter 21 is a lot of Johnny Truant like journal entries where you get a little bit of an look at some of his exploration. Like apparently he went to Virginia to try to find the house, maybe, and also some other stuff going on there that I just really don't know how to interpret. And some of the letters are in different orders, but between all of that and the different references to things that happen with a recordance to his ramblings and his footnotes throughout the book, a person could make an entire essay just talking about Johnny Truant and piecing together his timeline within this entire narrative structure and what's going on there and his work on the book and all of that kind of stuff. And that would be something that would be probably pretty interesting to do. But again, like I'm not going to do that. I'm sure there's probably some people that have done something like that. So House of Leaves would be super rich from like a meta textual, like constructionary angle, in terms of just the subtext and the meta text that you could look into for House of Leaves. A lot there, and a lot of it has to do with Johnny Truant. But with regards to the actual narrative itself, reading this book as a book like one time, I'm not going to be going through this multiple times trying to piece together stuff. I'm not going to spend, months of my life trying to like really do something with this book. A lot of Johnny Truant stuff just doesn't fully work if you're reading it in that way. So I understand some of my friends who gave this like a 4 out of 5, largely because of Johnny Truant stuff. Like I said at the beginning of this video, the Johnny Truant stuff definitely holds the book back a little bit, because it's kind of random and doesn't, the vast majority of it doesn't really have much to do with the Davidson record, you know? Which, understandably enough, really Johnny Truant's inclusion in the book, the only like active service that it is to the book from just a general reading perspective is giving you that very tangible, like, okay, yeah, a different character compiled the Davidson record that we're reading about in this book. That's cool. That's a cool meta angle to read the book from. But outside of that surface level, what Johnny Truant is, a lot of his materials just kind of hit or miss. Like I said, it's fine. I could go into some of the details of what actually happens in some of the stuff in chapter 21 specifically, but I just don't feel like I need to. Like, I'm sorry, I don't feel like I need to. I really don't. It doesn't really matter that much. Like, there's some interesting things to talk about from chapter 21, like Johnny Truant encountering some people who knew about House of Leaves, because apparently while Johnny Truant was like so in-depth working on the book, he had apparently managed to get a version of this book published onto the internet that other people just around the world had been able to encounter and read. So other people knew of the house because of him, but him not really remembering doing this thing. So you get little flashes like that where it's like, okay, cool. I like how that works into Johnny Truant's work on the book, work on the Davidson record, and how that relates from that metatextual aspect. But again, most of the events themselves that happen is like whatever. Like Lude dies, for example, and Johnny Truant nearly gets beat up by the same guy, or he does get beat up by the same guy who killed Ludo or something. I don't remember. And all this comes about because of an affair he had with this guy's fiance, and him pushing off the fiance one other time, making her mad. So she told her man about it, that she was assaulted. And so these two are being hunted by this. Like, what does this matter? It doesn't really matter, in my opinion. That's not necessarily what I mean, though. It's not that it doesn't matter, in my opinion. It's that it's not super relevant in a way that I feel like I need to go over in this video, right? It's not something that I need to summarize or explain. It's like, it's something that exists in the book. And if you want to look more into that yourself, I recommend reading House of Leaves for sure. And I recommend that people look into some of this angle for themselves. Go into it kind of expecting to have to dig into it. In fact, if you happen to be a person who is watching these videos without having read the book for some reason, I don't know why you would do that. You're a crazy person if you do. But if you go into this book knowing exactly what it's doing and looking to explore some of that analytic angle that you could do, that analyzing angle, you could do a lot of work with House of Leaves. Like I said, this is one that a person could read multiple times in multiple different ways, reconstructing and reordering and taking different notes and doing different analyses on different specific stuff, and be able to, a person could probably make not like an entire career per se, but you could make a pretty solid leg of a career as an analysis person just through this book, because there's enough going on in it. But not a lot of that stuff I feel like I need to get into for the purposes of a diary. So to wrap this up, I had a really good time with House of Leaves, and a lot of what happened the last couple weeks surprised me and did things in different orders than I was expecting, and was just really enjoyable to experience. I really enjoyed my time with this book, but there's also a degree to which it was a little bit much. Like I said, with the Johnny Truant stuff is just kind of okay, in my opinion. Something that I would have to look into more and do with more time, just to make it work, right? Just to make myself enjoy it more and be able to appreciate it more, rather. But not something that I'm going to actually be doing, unfortunately. But that is probably just going to wrap up this diary. I enjoyed this book a lot. It was definitely a fun experience. I will never forget reading this book for sure. House of Leaves is probably the most unique book I've ever read, just in terms of what it's doing and how it's doing it. So for that reason, it's totally worth experiencing. But my spoiler-free review for this book will go up sometime in November here. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on this for now. Thank you for watching if you did. If there's any like really cool aspects of this book that really struck you, that you want to discuss a little bit more, shout some of those things out in the comments below, and I'll like interact about that, like kind of my thoughts. talk about that a little bit more specifically, but as far as this diary, I think that's all I need to go into, and since this thing is an hour long at this point anyway, I should probably just cut it off there. Thank you so much for watching. If you did, I really appreciate it. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.